Every year we do one exercise for subway and one for commuter rail. Because they cover such a large area of the city and the state, we try to move to a new location each year. We identify the local fire, police, and EMS agencies, and we work with them over the course of about 3 to 4 months and develop a scenario based on their specific concerns or anything that maybe is happening recently within the MBTA that we can kind of test out. And we run through a simulated emergency where a train has to be actually evacuated.
Welcome back to Spilling the Tea, the MBTA podcast where we take you behind the scenes to discuss the people, policies, and preparations that keep it moving. I'm your host, Andrew Cassidy of the MBTA's Customer and Employee Experience Department, and today I'm thrilled to welcome McKinley Theobald, the Deputy Director of Emergency Management at MassDOT. With years of experience in emergency planning and operations, McKinley plays a key role in ensuring that MassDOT and the T are ready for anything, from routine disruptions to major emergencies. As we head into the winter months, she'll be sharing insights into what it takes to prepare for snowstorms, icy conditions, and other seasonal challenges while keeping riders safe and service running smoothly. McKinley, thank you so much for joining us here today.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm excited to be here.
Let's start with your current role at MassDOT. You were recently appointed as the Deputy Director of Emergency Management. What does that role entail, and how does that work intersect with the MBTA?
My department is Security and Emergency Management, and that's a shared service department that works closely both with each of the divisions of MassDOT, so that's RMV, Aeronautics, and Highway, as well as with the MBTA. That department is split into two groups, the security side and the emergency management side. So I, as deputy director, lead the emergency management team. I think a lot of people listening probably won't be familiar with what emergency management is. So I'd love to take a moment just to, talk about what that is. So EM, emergency management, the profession, is a profession that helps create a framework for organizations to prepare for, respond to, recover from, and mitigate against disasters. And a disaster being a hazard that produces an impact that is greater than that community's ability to address on their own. That's kind of the textbook EM 101 definition. So when you're thinking about that from the MBTA perspective, I am thinking about large weather events, so hurricanes, major winter storms, things like that will really stretch our ability to handle on our day-to-day basis. A lot of that work for me includes writing and updating plans. So that's our comprehensive emergency management plan, severe weather plan, snow and ice plan. We also do tabletop exercises every year, as well as full-scale exercises, both with the subway and the commuter rail, as well as whenever we have a special event, so like 4th of July, the marathon, things like that, or a actual emergency event, then I help to manage our emergency operations center. So all of those things make up the emergency management realm.
So you mentioned the Emergency Operations Center. That's something I've had to partake in for many years now, but others might not be aware of what exactly that is. Can you describe what the Emergency Operations Center is?
Absolutely. So an EOC, as it's usually called, is the standard method for an organization or jurisdiction on any levels, whether that's a county level, state, federal, to basically get information from the field and make strategic decisions about how to move forward, what things to prioritize in an emergency or a disaster, and to have a full picture, a situational awareness of the entire event. So when we do an EOC with the MBTA, we're bringing in leadership from each of the departments that are involved in that event. That can change depending on what that event is. We may have, for some events, a smaller group of people in the room, or if it's a really large event, we might want more departments represented so that we can have a quick way of sharing information and responding to whatever that incident is.
So you've had a fairly progressive career in emergency management. How have your past roles really helped you prepare for the complexities of managing transportation-specific emergencies?
Before I worked at MassDOT, and I've been here about 4 years now, I worked for a few years in higher ed emergency management, a couple of schools in Rhode Island, and then here in Boston, I worked at Northeastern University. And you would think that that was a very different environment, and in some ways it is, but a lot of the details actually are very similar because a university campus is a lot like a small city. And you end up having to make some of the same decisions about, how do you protect the population? How do you share information? Things like that really are going to be the same no matter where you're working. I certainly am not a subject matter expert in a lot of, subway information. There's stuff I am still constantly learning. And I do rely a lot on my connections to other departments and people who can give me information about how things work. I think ultimately EM is a lot about facilitating conversation, getting the right people in the room, and starting to guide improvements where you see people say like, oh, this isn't really working for me. And then making sure that you can have those conversations, dig a little bit deeper about, okay, what's not working? How does this apply to other events? And having that kind of big picture perspective of what's happening throughout the entire organization, even if I don't understand every single detail of what happens out in the field.
You make a really interesting point about that similarity between higher education and the management of that kind of small city, small community. I too worked in higher ed prior to joining the MBTA and had to do emergency communications, whether it be sometimes it was a bomb threat or something of that nature, but more oftentimes it was hurricanes because it was down in Miami. But transitioning to up here, hurricanes are slightly less of an issue. The bigger issue that's usually on everyone's mind, especially this time of year, despite it being a warm year so far, is winter. And winter in New England is no joke. How is it that MassDOT and by extension the MBTA prepare for the unique challenges posed by snow, ice, and freezing temperatures?
I wasn't in Boston in 2015 for those winter storms. Were you here for that?
No, I was in sunnier places.
I was actually in colder places in North Dakota at that time, but I know that year's snow event was really impactful to the MBTA and has shaped a lot of the conversations about snow response today, even still. The snow and ice plan that we have now that we update and maintain is based a lot on the response to that storm. So there's certainly a higher understanding of the risk of winter storms here than I think any other hazard, which in some ways actually makes things easier for me because people understand that it's a big deal. They're interested in planning for it. Every year we update our snow and ice plan. So actually we are currently finishing up that update. So that document describes how the MBTA operates in some pretty high detail around winter storms. So things like locations of various materials like ice melt, generators, where those are, things like that, as well as some of the specific tasks that departments take in the lead up to a winter storm. So every year we ask departments to review that plan, refamiliarize themselves with it, and make sure that they're ready to go as we head into the winter season. I do also like to do a tabletop exercise every year, and that's something we're planning right now. For the last couple of years, we've done one focused on winter events. So last year, I did one that was kind of a two-parter where we started with a scenario where they had a heavy snow event and how does the T respond to heavy snow and what are the specific operations that we need to do to handle that. And then a second module that was focused on ice. And there are some differences. Obviously, you have to worry about people's safety in slightly different ways, and it changes how the T prepares and responds to the event, whether it's a snow or an ice event. So that gives us the opportunity again to refresh their understanding of the snow and ice plan and have some time to kind of hash out any changes that have happened in the last year. Things like, departments moving, being under new leadership. Maybe this is an opportunity for them to just get a better understanding in general of how the T operates. I find that to be a really, really useful period of time, to actually sit down and talk through some of these things because we don't have that opportunity all that often. So
how early does the MBTA and MassDOT start preparing for winter?
From our department's perspective, it takes us a month or two to do those updates. it takes a while because we have to, track down every department, make sure that they've looked at their plan and had a chance to review it. So for us, that's about how long we take. I'm sure that that's different within different departments within the T, if they need specific materials, if they need to order ahead for something, or we ask them also to update their rosters for snow teams, the various like field teams that we have, yard leads, things like that. So depending on that and whatever other operations they have to prepare ahead of time, it may take longer.
Now, beyond the MBTA and MassDOT, obviously we all function within the different communities and municipalities surrounding the system itself and the roads. What does that coordination look like? How are you, and again, by extension, the MBTA, working with these local municipalities when severe weather is in the forecast and the, I guess, follow-up of impacts thereafter?
There's a few different things that my department does to work with local communities and other agencies. So one of the biggest ones that we're pretty consistently involved with is the Massachusetts Emergency Management Agency, which is the state level emergency management agency. Specifically, we are the lead agency for their transportation emergency support function. And that sounds probably like a bit of gibberish, but essentially the emergency support function structure allows MEMA to call in specific resources to their emergency operations center ahead of an event, so that they can have a quick coordination point with those resources. So when our department is responding to the state EOC, if there's been a large event, so that includes snow events, that's actually the most common reason that we activate with them. We represent in that role not only the MBTA, but also all of MassDOT and a lot of other transportation agencies and resources in the area. So that also includes the Steamship Authority, the various regional transportation authorities, Massport, each of those as a connection to MEMA if they need a specific resource. And also to share information both with them and back to the MBTA if there's something happening. Additionally, I think it's really important to remember as part of our planning, this is something I'm constantly thinking about, is that the MBTA is deeply interconnected with the city. And we move a lot of people for a lot of different reasons that, of course, will still need to be moved, even if we're headed into a winter storm or something else. One of the best examples of that, I think, is that our medical system in Boston really heavily relies on the Blue Line. A lot of medical personnel live in East Boston, and they take the Blue Line to commute by train to their hospital. And I occasionally, ahead of major events, I'll get a call from the DPH saying, like, do we expect any shutdowns of the Blue Line or other parts of the system? And thankfully, so far, I've always been able to tell them no, like, we continue to expect to provide service. But if we did, I would be communicating with them, like, pretty directly. And additionally, any other communities that maybe need resources, we occasionally get requests through MEMA for cooling buses or warming buses in, hot weather or very cold weather. So I work with them to help provide those resources if needed.
That's actually a really interesting thing. That was something I learned very shortly after joining the T about 5 years ago. But one of those kind of unsung kindnesses, truthfully, that I see the MBTA offering basically buses as temporary shelter, sometimes following a fire or things of that nature, where, again, you don't expect to see public transit in that function, but it's a really spectacular thing that we're able to, find a way to help out in whatever way that we can in that moment. You mentioned doing tabletop exercises to try and, prepare for whatever disasters or emergencies might appear. However, sometimes maybe the tabletop isn't quite as hands-on as some learners might need. I know very recently even you conducted a full-scale emergency exercise both on the commuter rail and on subway. Can you talk us through what's involved in these exercises? I've seen the pictures. I've gone out to a couple of them, but they're quite convincing. Let's say that. But if you could give us just kind of an overview of what these exercises are and why they're so important for the MBTA and MassDOT to conduct.
I think these exercises are actually some of the most important work that our department does, other than actual incident response. every year we do one exercise for subway and one for commuter rail. Because they cover such a large area of the city and the state, we try to move to a new location each year. And what we do is we identify the local fire, police, and EMS agencies, and we work with them over the course of about 3 to 4 months and develop a scenario based on their specific concerns or anything that maybe is happening recently within the MBTA that we can kind of test out. And we run through a simulated emergency where a train has to be actually evacuated. So those scenarios can include things like a derailment, striking a car at a grade crossing, a fire on the train, that sort of thing. That's actually what we did for our last one, was a fire on the train where someone pulls the emergency brake, and then the commuter rail has to come to a pretty extreme stop. We have injuries to the volunteers. So in order to do these simulated injuries, not real ones, we get volunteers from the community usually, and sometimes we'll, depending on what the fire and EMS team wants, sometimes we'll do them up with makeup that looks like an injury, which is fun, add some realism. And then the exercise starts with whatever the scenario is having just happened, right? And then the train is already, of course, at a stop on the rail wherever we've decided to do that exercise. And then the EMS and police and fire agencies will respond to that as if it is a real incident. So they get on the train, they will triage the injuries, make sure that everyone's evacuated, deal with whatever the incident is. So if it's a fire, then, pretending to put it out without putting water on the train. That's a pretty hard rule. And we test each of those responses. So we're monitoring the whole exercise to make sure that specific actions get taken that are described in their emergency management plans and our emergency management plans. We make sure internally, do the conductors know to contact the OCC or the commuter rail OCC? Are they providing the right info? How do they talk to the customers? How does that communication work both with the conductor or the first responders that are actually responding to the incident? And these are fantastic exercises, but they do rely on a lot of involvement from a lot of different agencies. So they're a lot of work, but really fun.
A couple episodes back, we had Joanne Daniels-Feingold on, and she uses a mobility device, and she had actually partaken in one of these exercises in the past. I'm not sure which municipality, but she mentioned that, there was a little bit of a learning curve for, I think, the emergency responders there to be able to get her out of her wheeled mobility device and get her to safety in a confined space. So with feedback like that, and obviously from the first responders themselves and from MassDOT and those on high kind of, taking notes as the whole thing is underway, how do you utilize that feedback? How does that experiential learning translate into, I guess, improved emergency response down the road?
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up. We always include the MBTA system-wide accessibility department when we're planning these exercises. And as part of it, we try to include volunteers that have disabilities of some kind. So making sure that all of our first responders are comfortable helping passengers with mobility devices is a huge part of these exercises. So making sure that they can help people with wheelchairs, moving them into a striker chair, for example, making sure that as they're doing that, they're communicating effectively with that passenger, or, how to help guide a passenger using a cane or who has low visibility. Each of those things, giving them an environment where they can actually test that in a realistic scenario, has been very, very helpful for our fire and police and EMS agencies. We usually get feedback from those agencies that they learned quite a bit from that process. And we almost always will have a after action item after we do the exercise where we encourage them to pursue additional training and make sure that that learning is passed on to the rest of the department. And also things like communicating effectively with passengers who are hard of hearing or who maybe speak another language. We have obviously a pretty diverse community in Boston, so we try to make sure that we are representing that with the folks who are playing in the exercise as volunteers. We do also, after the exercise, have a hot wash or basically a debrief session with those volunteers so we can get their feedback about what went well, what went not as well, so that we can provide that to those agencies as well and say, hey, you didn't do a great job of dealing with, this passenger who was in a mobility device. And here's the things that you should make sure to do when you're handling situations that include passengers who need that additional help.
Super interesting because there's just so many different pieces to it. Obviously, you're MassDOT. You're dealing with something on a commuter rail, which is run by Keolis for the MBTA, which is its own thing. Then you're in whatever municipality dealing with their police and fire. I'm guessing maybe transit police is also involved. So you really have so many different pieces, not including all the volunteers who are representing even more communities. It's just wild to think about how complex it is and how you really do need each of those pieces in order to get that realistic value, I suppose.
And not only do they need to be able to work well with us, but they need to work well with each other. And that's so much of it as well, making sure that they're setting up an incident command post, that they're communicating, that they're on the right radio channel. There's all of those things that are happening in the background that maybe folks at the MBTA or people in the community may not really be aware of.
I think you've touched on this a little bit just with the exercises, but aside from winter weather, what are some of the other critical scenarios you've had to plan for or deal with? And how do you ensure that the MBTA and MassDOT are prepared for whatever sort of unexpected disruptions might take place?
You mentioned hurricanes earlier, and while we have not had one of those yet,
fingers crossed,
I always get nervous during hurricane season. That's one of the other things I spend a lot of time thinking about and planning for. When we had an almost impact by Hurricane Lee last year, I was doing a lot of work ahead of that to make sure that we were prepared at the MBTA, but also we had a request from the city of Boston to potentially help them evacuate various areas of the city.
Wow.
So we were doing some pre-planning to make sure that if they did need that resource, that we could help make that happen and provide a few buses for them and make sure that buses were going to the right location and picking people up and dropping them off at a kind of a central point to then theoretically be transferred further if needed. So things like that definitely come up occasionally. We also support major planned events. I mentioned the 4th of July earlier and the marathon. Those are a couple of the large ones, and St. Patrick's Day as well. The marathon, of course, is like the big event in Boston, in Massachusetts, and requires a lot of planning by the state in general. So MEMA handles a lot of the public safety related planning for that. So we participate in that process and usually activate as part of their unified command center, as well as staffing the EOC here at the MBTA. So those are kind of constantly, there's always something happening. We're getting prepared already for FIFA. That's in 2026, but already thinking about it. So there's always something.
That's wild. And again, it's such a range because you're talking about, impending natural disasters with hurricane force winds, and then also, a duck boat parade where there's a lot of people come to celebrate, a very different environment, but still something that, requires that additional oversight and management. You've discussed this a couple of times, but the Emergency Operations Center, the EOC, they're critical for these events, but can you kind of describe exactly, I guess, how information sharing takes place? Can you even just try and articulate, I suppose, a visual for our listeners as to what the scene is in like the EOC?
Well, we're all usually sitting around a table in a conference room and checking in on a regular basis. So that's really where a lot of the in the moment communication happens. But before the EOC is even activated, there's usually planning meetings ahead of time if it's something that we know is coming. So for things like the marathon or these other large planned events, or even a large winter storm maybe that we've seen on the forecast, what we'll do is we'll set up a couple of meetings ahead of that activation, whatever that event is, so that we can discuss as an agency what's happening in different departments, who's preparing in what ways, so that that information can get pretty easily disseminated quickly across the agency. So we know, okay, because this is St. Patrick's Day, we know we have to close down certain head houses. And what does that mean about the way that bus routes change ahead of, St. Patrick's Day or other events, things like that. And so then as that information gets shared, then other departments who may have a tie into that can start to do their work once they know what those decisions have been. In the EOC, while the event is happening, we do check-ins depending on the cadence of the event, how quickly things are changing. Maybe we'll do every 2 hours, maybe we'll do every 4 hours, but we'll do an around the horn where each department reports out about anything that's affecting them at the time, any concerns that they have that they think might affect the next operational period, as it's known in emergency management, so that next period of planning, so that we can start to make moves to respond to whatever those incidents are.
As far as the pre-meetings go, I was impressed again, early days being in those meetings where, you're meeting with NOAA and they're the ones who are giving you the exact, specifications as to we're expecting this, it's not your local news forecast.
Yeah,
it is
Boston,
very
NOAA,
in depth. It is, these are the swells at this time of day. This might impact this area in such a way. It's really fascinating to know that there is that level of collaboration that you really do not see as a lay person.
Our local NOAA team is fantastic to work with. They're very easy to get information from, and I'm really grateful that they're willing to step into calls like that, because that information is incredibly valuable. I know it helps a lot of different people make decisions ahead of an event.
Absolutely. Emergencies rarely happen during the workday. And I think it's important people know that, the MBTA, despite having certain service hours, is very much a 24-hour organization, as is MassDOT. And when you're activating an EOC, people can be on, depending on the situation, for multiple days. They'll do 12-hour shifts, and then the next shift comes on, next one comes off. How do you manage that kind of continuity for these more long-term pieces? It's not just it snowed one day and that's it. The snow stopped falling, therefore it's over. It's very frequently these are multi-day events. So how does that work?
Usually those shifts are 12-hour shifts, so that can be difficult even for one shift to cover those. So what we do for these is always make sure that when that shift change is happening, that the incoming person is getting a rundown of what has happened during that last 12 hours from the person who has been in the EOC. So they're sharing that information. They're sharing, here's what our priorities are. Here's what we've been working on. These are the incidents that we have experienced during those 12 hours, so that there's a continuity between both of those, that they continue to, work on the same items and have that big picture understanding of what's been happening. We often do overlap the last around the horn with the first around the horn of the next incoming group, so that they can hear what's been being discussed in the EOC. And my team supports both the MBTA EOCs and the MEMA EOCs at some times. So we'll have 2 sets of these 12-hour shifts happening, which can be a lot to manage. But, setting up a schedule ahead of time, making sure that we have internally good communication and that we're sharing anything that's happening as it's happening is really important. And making sure that information is documented in a way that the incoming person can continue to see them.
Another topic that you touched upon are after action reviews. And again, I know what these can be a part of, just to kind of see what went right, what went wrong. And I know you mentioned that you use them following these emergency exercises, but can you talk us through what the process is like, what the motivation and justification is like for actual emergencies?
So after an event, what we try to do is gather any information about, what happened actually. Like, here's a timeline of the actions that we took. And if something didn't go the way that it should have, starting to investigate why maybe those things happened. Is it because we have a specific procedure that wasn't being followed, or do we not have procedures that we need? Trying to gather all of that information. And then what we do is we have an after action review where We have a meeting with all of the relevant departments or people who are involved in whatever that incident is. Hopefully someone who is actually on scene, depending on what the event was. And we'll walk through the event, what happened, and start to talk about what went well and what didn't go so well, so that we can identify specific things to improve. This is something that's really important for emergency management. You have to kind of close the loop, right? You go through an event, people during that event will notice that something isn't going the way that it should, but you have to capture that information and make sure that it's documented so that you can refer to it and actually start to make changes. Emergency management in general is a very, iterative process. We're constantly improving because the environment is constantly changing. So there's always something to update, procedures to change, procedures to write. Once we finish the after action review, we'll write a after action report. And that report gives an overview of the incident as well as those specific improvement actions that we recommend, or actually that departments usually have identified themselves, where they say, hey, we didn't do this the way that we should have done it. We need to update our procedures, or we need to train people in a certain way, or we need this other department to give us specific information. So we document that and we help to make sure that departments are actually making those improvements. Depending on the incident, we do also work with outside agencies. So the full-scale exercises, these are a good example of that. We always do an after-action review and write an after-action report after those exercises. And one of the items that we've gotten from those before, so Boston Fire Department, after one of our exercises, they were like, hey, sometimes when we have an incident where the train is really far away from a station, we have a hard time getting everyone out to that train, making sure that we can get everyone back, moving equipment, things like that. And it would really help us if we had more Nolan carts. I don't know if you're familiar with what a Nolan cart is, but essentially it's a cart that can sit on the track and roll down the track. So you can easily move equipment or people if you need to. Yep. Like if you have someone who has a mobility device or something like that you can put them on a Nolan cart and just roll them back instead of needing to carry people. Makes things a lot easier. So we ended up working with the Boston Fire Department to purchase Nolan carts for them. And they already had a few, so they already knew how to use them, but just helping give them that, expanded resource. They've been really grateful for that. They do annual training of their team on those Nolan carts, and they do use them in emergencies. So it's really fantastic that we were able to take feedback from that exercise and help them implement that improvement.
We've talked a lot about continuous learning and continuous improvement. What sort of new strategies or technologies are being considered or somewhere on the horizon to enhance emergency response and winter readiness for both MassDOT and the MBTA?
So we are definitely constantly thinking about ways to improve as a department, as an agency, in our communication with other agencies. One of the things that my department is working on right now is some efforts to increase our situational awareness in EOCs. It can be difficult sometimes to know everything that's happening in the field in context with each other. So one of the things we're doing right now is building a GIS-based platform that will be able to show some detailed weather information as well as trigger notifications when we meet, specific thresholds as described in our snow and ice plan and our severe weather plan. And that will additionally have some real-time alerting happening and status information of various aspects of the T and of our response. Also updating our situation reports just so that they have some better information, more useful information. And in general, providing more training where we can, working with the local first responders as much as possible, continuing to develop those relationships, giving them, again, as much training and familiarization with the T as possible. We always do training in the lead up to our exercises, but I want to make sure that, we're giving as many local agencies that opportunity as possible, even if we're not doing an exercise with them in the near future. So trying to expand that. And also always, adding more information to our plans. We've been talking as a department recently about adding more information about heat into our severe weather plan. That's something that has become more of a concern in recent years, I think. We've seen hotter summer seasons here, and adding more information about ice to our snow and ice plan, because we've really been so much more focused on snow because of those 2015 snows than we have on ice, even though there's some information in there, but really expanding that, starting to nail down specific thresholds where, if we hit certain temperatures or certain levels of ice, then maybe that means our operations change in a certain way, and trying to figure out what those changes actually look like. And I know that those things are happening out in the agency, but actually getting it written down, documented, is a huge part of what I'm trying to do.
Amazing. Thank you so much, McKinley, for joining us on Spilling the Tea today.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Once again, I want to thank McKinley for giving us a look at the critical work that goes into emergency preparedness at MassDOT and the MBTA. As we brace for the winter months, I appreciate the planning and coordination that goes into keeping the system moving, even when the snow starts falling. To all of our listeners, thank you for tuning in to Spilling the Tea. Be sure to follow us on your favorite podcast platform and check out mbta.com for the latest updates on service and winter preparedness. As always, if you have any questions or suggestions for future episodes, please send us an email to social@mbta.com. We love hearing your ideas and feedback. Until next time, stay warm, stay safe, and thank you for riding the tea.